Okay, let's draw a flower and then some of the parts inside so that you have that information with the gametophyte and the sporophyte and that kind of thing. We have the male part is the stamen, yes, is the stamen. And you have basically two parts to that. One part is what holds the thing up. Not as, I would say, not as big of a deal, but this, the filament. Then you have the part on top where the pollen is actually made. That's the anther. Drew that top yellow for the pollen. That's the male part. So that's going to be where the sperm is produced in the anther. Then you have the female part here. Just for labeling purposes. So there's three parts to this. This top part here is where the pollen lands. And we call it the stigma. That's where pollination happens. So pollination is just where the pollen lands, and then it's going to grow a tube down. So it's sort of sticky. And then you have the part that's just holding not very well, but style. And then down here, you guys saw dissections, ovary. And the ovary is where the egg is ultimately. And that's where fertilization happens. And all of those together is the carpel or pistil. So the single one is the pistil, and when they're together, whatever that together is, they make the carpel. Not really interchangeable, but pistil is the single thing. All of them together make the carpel. I'm not too picky about it for our class. L-E-E-L? I don't know. I write pistol mostly because I just do one of them at a time. Someone have that on hand? Spelling of that? No?
I think it's EL.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. And that's the female part. The whole thing together. And then we got the petals, and that's mostly for attracting pollinators and getting them somewhere to land. Sepals, which are protecting the bud. And then the receptacle holds the ovary up, and then the stem. So, okay. Does everyone have that okay? There's There's these sacs in the anther. That's the point. So those are initially in there. There's a sporophyte. So this is how pollen is going to form, and the pollen contains sperm cells. Okay, so this is the like the Russian nesting idea. It's like that you have. This is the sporophyte, right? So the anther is the sporophyte because it's part of the plant that you see. That's important. So this is the sporophyte version of the plant. And we know that sporophytes are always 2N. And that's just from the life cycle thing. So this in here, like this. This is sporocyte. This nucleus. And the sporocyte is part of the sporophyte. Okay, so it's just the sporophyte part. And so that is going to make spores, right? So sporophyte makes the spores, the gametophyte makes the gametes, and they go back and forth. So the sporophyte is going to make spores. And so that is what it's going to do. And so it's going to, each spore, if you remember, spores and gametes are always N. They're always haploid. So that's one thing you got to like remember. Spores are always haploid. So if we're going from a sporocyte to a haploid spore, then we think going 2N to N, that must mean that we're having the amount of chromosomes, which is mitosis. I mean, excuse me, meiosis, right? Meiosis goes from N to 2N to N. So basically, meiosis. Let's see. And then we get a thick wall. That's important. Get a cell inside. And it has a nucleus, of course. This is now haploid. And that is spore. Really? You remember meiosis goes 2 rounds of division, right? So in the end, you actually have 4 of these. Not too worried about that. But you have times 4. And what's the important part? So we have here the sporopollenin. That's really important because it helps it from drying out. That's one of those things that land plants have that the algae don't have. And they have sporopollenin in their walls of spores and also around pollen when they have it. So sporopollenin here. The inside is the spore. prevents it drying out. These don't need water anymore because it's got that sporopollen around the, we'll see it around the spore and then in fact the pollen. So that is your sporopollen in the spore. And then, oh, and also note that these spores are genetically unique. Because they did meiosis. So the genetic variation between the 4 different spores. Get my other program where I can shrink the stuff. Do it next time. So now we've got a spore. So we got sporophytes, a spore, and then we know spores grow up into gametophytes, and the gametophytes make gametes, which then fertilize. They go back to sporophytes in that way. You remember that? Remember that? Sporophyte, spore, spore to gametophyte, gametophyte to gametes, back to sporophyte. Okay. So if we have a spore here, we know that that's going to then become a gametophyte. Now, like in something like moss, the sporophyte is, show you. So in a moss, which is a bryophyte, the non-vascular plants, we've got the sporophyte, which is the little sticky uppy parts. Sporophyte there. And the sporophyte makes spores inside its sac. That's just what we saw here, but in the anther. Anthers are only in flowers. But I just want to show you how this is different. So we've got the sporophyte making spores, and then those spores grow up into the gametophyte, which is the green stuff, the green carpet. That's the gametophyte. And then it has the gametophyte makes gametes, and then those fertilize on the green, and then they go back into spores. And so it just cycles like that. But you see that the gametophyte and the sporophyte are actually 2 separate things. One of them is this brown thing that has its own capsule, and then the other one is that green moss, and they exist separately. In ferns or in seedless vascular, we have 2 separate body forms of sporophytes and gametophytes. So here's your sporophyte. So let's just start with that, okay? And this is actually the fern. So the fern that you see is the sporophyte. In that fern, there are these little sori, and they make spores. So they undergo meiosis, and spores are made there. And that's what these are. So the spores are released, genetically varied, haploid. They fall on the ground somewhere, and those spores grow into the gametophyte, which is really tiny. This is like under the microscope. So it's a gametophyte, a heart-shaped thing. The gametophyte makes gametes. So part of this is going to make eggs, part of it will make sperm. Still haploid. So it makes those through mitosis. The sperm swims over, fertilizes the egg, and then the egg, now it's 2N because it's a zygote, then the egg grows back up into the sporophyte, which then makes spores via meiosis. Those spores fall on the ground. They grow up into this gametophyte. The gametophyte then produces eggs and sperm that fertilizes, the sperm fertilizes the egg by swimming, and then it grows up into a sporophyte and so forth. So you've got like the fern itself, and then you've got the gametophyte, so those are separate. By the time you get to gymnosperms, which are the seed plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms, you've got cones going on, and that's when you start to have the pollen, and you start to have the gametophyte, call it dependent gametophyte. So the gametophyte is, or reduced, I should say, reduced gametophyte. Now instead of having its own entity, the gametophyte is going to be part of the sporophyte. So let's see here. So the sporophyte is the tree. Part of that tree is the cone. So this is part of the cone. It's just a cut through. The cone is a spore, the sporophyte. So it's diploid. The spore is the sporophyte, and it's diploid. So the diploid cone cells in here make the haploid spores. Those spores make gametophytes that live within here. So now they don't go off onto their own. So their spores stay in there. They mature into gametophytes. Those gametophytes divide and make gametes. The gamete would be a here, no longer fertile. In the female, you've got the cone, which is the sporophyte, and then that's diploid, makes haploid spore. That spore then divides and inside itself makes the gametophyte. Gametophyte then divides in itself and makes the gamete. So here it'll make an egg. This will make a sperm. And really the sperm is just nuclei. It's in pollen. Sporopollen, and again, that's going to go and land on the female cone. Fertilization would happen there and make a zygote, 2N, and that would grow up into a tree. So it would make the seed and then grow up into a tree. And so that's how that cycle works. So you can see it's very different here, where you have the sporophyte is separate from the gametophyte. But by the time we get to seed plants, it's all like sporophyte makes spores. Spores divide into gametophyte. Gametophyte divides into gametes. Gametes fertilize and they make a zygote, which grows up into the sporophyte. That's all like that. Then we get to angiosperms, which is what I'm attempting to draw here. And we have the anthers, part of the stamen, and we have the stigma-style ovary, the pistil part, which forms a carpel when it's all of them together. And so you can see here at the pollen, so this is what I'm drawing right now. We've got the sporophyte making spores. Those spores are going to divide, and it's going to make a gametophyte inside of it. The gametophyte's going to make 2 sperm nuclei, which are gametes, and then the pollen gets released and falls onto the stigma of the female part. The female part, this is the cut through of the carpel. It's the sporophyte. The sporophyte in here makes spores. Then those spores make divide into gametophytes. Gametophytes divide into gametes, so you'll have an egg in here eventually. And if the pollen lands on here and grows a tube, if the tube gets down to the ovary, that's what we're looking at here, the ovary, and it gets to the egg, then it can do fertilization and you get a zygote, turns into a seed, the seed drops off, and then it's going to, or the seed turns into a fruit, actually, in this case, or the ovary. So the fruit goes around the seed gets dispersed, the seed grows back up into a new flower plant. So it's like that idea here. So the seed in this one's inside of this fruit, and then that gets distributed. Then the seeds here are now inside of this fruit, that gets distributed. Same here. So let me draw this last half of this crazy Russian nesting idea. And we're like doing I know it seems like a lot, but we're doing a simplified version of this, so it's not. So we're at the spore with the sporopollen. And then that spore is going to need to make a gametophyte. So we'll just look at one of them. That spore is going to still keep the sporopollen. Sporopollen and spore, and it just divides inside by mitosis. So we've got mitosis inside of this, and you end up with This is N. End up with another N, the gametophyte. So this is all within the anther still. I don't care that you know about these cell names. Cells in there. Mostly I'm concerned that you know that this is the gametophyte inside of that sporophyte. The gametophyte is going to make the gametes. So still within the sporopollen wall. This four. Divide. Then we divide again. That's by mitosis. Basically end up with these guys, which are the important parts here. And I will have a picture like this. This is why I'm taking the time to draw it, because I have one like this on the exam. Okay, so within the gametophyte, it's now made to sperm. Really, it's just basically two sperm nuclei, really. So that's the gamete. So the gametophyte just divided inside itself and make the gamete. And this is still within the sporopollen, and this whole thing here is pollen. That's the idea there. Okay. So you can see what I mean about that Russian nesting doll idea. And so you saw there's only one meiosis and then two mitosis rounds. Okay, and so then you've got the sperm and the pollen, and then that can get released and then goes to the female. And I'll draw that, like a simple version of that now. Is anyone, you can speak up. Does anyone need an explanation of any of that? Yeah, sure.
Difference between the spore and the gametophyte. I see that the gametophyte has sperm in it, but is that the only difference?
Yeah, well, so at the end, it's going to end up having the sperm. So the gametophyte has different cells in it. So the sporophyte, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure this. So the spore is like one cell, then it divides inside, and you've got the gametophyte. The gametophyte has what we call a vegetative cell, and it's a generative cell. So only the generative cell divides into like this guy here. Yeah. Okay, so only this cell divides into the sperm, while that cell doesn't. So this kind of stays at the gametophyte and the pollen turns into it. And I imagine all those cells have different genes being expressed because they do different things. So this one's getting stimulated to divide and mature into sperm, and then this other cell is not. And so, yeah, so they're actually different cell types, but they're all just within each other. So once the gametophyte, this generative cell divides, it matures into sperm, which are, first of all, which are expressing different genes, because then eventually those are going to pollinate the flower, and then they would grow down into the ovary and that kind of thing. So that's why we consider them different things, I believe, because gene expression wise and functionality wise, they're different. Does that make sense a little bit?
Sorry, didn't see
Okay.
it.
Okay. Okay, so let's draw a simplified version of the same sort of thing in females. And if you came in late, I have the other part of this picture. So before this, there's a sporophyte, which is basically, so obviously this is sexual reproduction, right? Because eggs and sperm. And you'll notice here, though, that it's the variation is generated in the spore forming step, not the gamete forming step, which is different from animals. You know, in animals we're used to like, ooh, meiosis makes sperm and eggs, but you'll notice here mitosis is what's making sperm and eggs. It's mitosis at this point. Meiosis is what makes the spores. And remember, in fungi, there's not even sperm and eggs. It doesn't even do that. So don't get hung up in your brain that just because animals do something, that's how like that everything. Okay, so the female part now. In the flower, style. Oh man, let's try it over. So this is within the flower. Go the ovary first. Good. Let's concentrate on the ovary part. I'm gonna leave out a little bit of stuff. You don't need it, and make our life more complicated. So. And there is a little opening here. That's important. That's where the sperm can get in. pollen to drop off the sperm. Okay, so that's a thicker area here. I've got a cell in here. Stuff around it, not too much. So it doesn't. Oh, what color did we do before? Okay. What color was our spore before? I don't have the picture. Greenish? Green. Great. Not quite yet. Started gray, and then we'll go green, because this is the spore site again. Right, so starting at the same spot that we started. This cell in here, that's the nucleus. Site means cell, as you know. So there's the sporocyte, the cell that will form the spore. And this is part of the sporophyte, the spore plant. Phyte means plant, plant-like. Spore plant makes the spore, has a sporocyte in it. And then that is going to make the spore. And sporocyte's 2N, and spores are N, means, I'm just going to draw the inside. So this is all happening in this whole ovary business. There's that same outer coat. That's the future seed coat. And just to this is the ovary. Okay, so we've got that same thing here. And now we have the division. And if you do N, 2N to N, this is going to be the spore, which we know spores are always haploid. That means we know the process that happened here is meiosis, because it went 2N to N. And so we know that that ends up with 4 cells. Do it fine enough. There we go. And nucleus for each. Those are nuclei. So this is 4 spores, and they're genetically varied. And draw them in. We did green last time, so. So now we've got our genetically varied spores, and actually in this case, in the females, three of them die. The one that doesn't die is the spore that will turn into the gametophyte. So still within this whole thing. So the one that doesn't die, I'll big again and then I'll think it later. Still on this integument structure, which again is going to form the seed coat still. There's some stuff that happens here, which I'm not going to be particular about. There's mitosis, a number of rounds of it. Need 3. Okay, so we've got mitosis happening now. Because this is a gametophyte. This is we did the gametophyte pink. Is that true? Somebody. Everybody. Did we draw the gametophyte pink last time or yellow for the male?
I think it was yellow.
All right, so it divides a number of times by mitosis because gametophytes are haploid. I mean, yeah, haploid. It's all haploid, except for the big plant. And then you get division in there, and the gametophyte's going to make the gametes, and this is the female part, so the gametes in this case are going to be eggs. And two other important cells. There's 8 cells total. I only need you to understand like 2 of them. Okay. That's that outer coat again. And then we have that inner cell. And now we have a bunch of cells. And you can see it's all happening like right in the same spot. So the important ones for us are this middle one here. So there's 3 down here. Two nuclei in there. It's 1 cell, just 2 nuclei. That's an important one. That's what we care about. Still considered immunophyte tissue, everything, except for one in the middle bottom, nearest to the opening. That one, I'm going to do it in red. Is the egg. Here's the 2 cells that you need to know. This red one here, egg, haploid. So the gametophyte nucleus, the gametophyte went to the gamete, and it's end to end. So that is again mitosis. And then the other cell you need to know is this middle one here with the 2 nuclei. It's called well, okay, it's the future endosperm. That's one word, sperm. There's the egg, there's the future endosperm. Those are the only two I care about. This one's special because it's diploid, which means when fertilization happens, it's actually going to get triploid. And so it's one of the very few cells that exists in a triploid form in anything, any organism. The endosperm. Right. So that's the female thing. So sporophyte, meiosis, spore, spore, mitosis, gametophyte, gametophyte, mitosis, egg, and then egg will get fertilized by sperm. So it's the same process again. This, of course, is within the ovary. Let's just look at the last part while we're here, if we can. All right, here's what I'm going to do. No way I can. I'll try it. Does everyone have that? Can I move it to another thing? And then we'll move forward after this. Assume that's a yes. All right, pollination. Pollen sticks to the stigma. And then it grows a tube down through the tissue. And I don't know, I asked a question about this. A lot of people miss it. So pollen grows a tube through the tissue here. And inside of the ovary, just like what we just saw, drawing a simplified version of this. So there's a little stalk that this whole deal attaches to. Want a little opening. Like what we've been drawing. And then the only thing I'm going to care about in here, there's a bunch of layers, but I'm just going to care about one. And we will has a bunch of cells, as you just saw. Small. 3 cells on the bottom, 3 cells on the top, and those 2 nuclei in the middle. That 1 cell there. Shrink it in a second. All right, this is the important egg cell. Haploid. There's this nucleus, 2 nuclei there. Sitting tube, of course. Okay, so the pollen tube's growing. It's a cell. Grows around here. So this is like one cell that grows this tube, and then it has the sperm cells in it, or the sperm nuclei, really. Great. So that's growing down. Not fertilization quite yet, but it's getting there. It's the tube. And the sperm cells. And I'm just going to draw the only one that you need to know is the egg cell, but it's other cells there, so you want to know that in general. Okay. The pollen tube grows down there, and it gets this is that outer thing that I've been drawing. You guys got it. And then what happens here is that with two sperm cells, one goes and fertilizes the egg, and the other one goes and combines with this future endosperm. I want it to be separate. Can't make it happen. I'm sorry. Wow, it's all separate. It's staying big. I'll just deal with it. Okay, so fertilization happens, and then in here, you get the zygote, of course, to turn into zygote. Hmm. Hmm. Because it's a combination of the two, right? That'll grow up into the new tree. At that part, and then you have the other part around it, and that's going to turn into the seed. And this is why it's called a retained embryo. We have that for all of them, dependent embryo, because it's inside the parent tissue. So everything degenerates, basically. That, the embryo inside, and then you have this triploid. So here is this guy, because if you think about it, a sperm nucleus and two other nuclei make this 3N, which is unusual. I know it's off, but I can't get it to properly. So then we've got the 3N endosperm out there. And then this has that coat around it, of course, and that is going to develop into the seed coat. And so then we'll have the endosperm, which is the part of the seed that is the food. This part. Confused with the yellow. So for the yellow, you can label that endosperm food. And this is why seeds are so important. And this is true in gymnosperms. Gymnosperms have a little bit different process, but it's basically the same. It's not an ovary. It doesn't develop into a fruit, but it does have an endosperm, which is the food. So it doesn't need the parent completely. It doesn't feed off the parent completely. That purple thing that we had was the zygote, which is going to grow up into the offspring. You know that. And this outside coat that I've been drawing is going to be the seed coat. So you have three major parts: zygote, endosperm, seed coat, and of course that protects it from drying. And that's part of the seed. The seed and pollen are all about not drying out. Thus, they don't have to live in wet environments anymore. Then I will So then I'm going to draw one more and then come back to that in a second, just to show you the whole thing overall. So then what we have here is what I just drew. But remember, that's inside the ovary. So now we've got a seed. So there's the zygote. There's the endosperm. Here's the seed coat. And then, of course, this is all inside the ovary. Which then becomes the fruit. I guess the fruit is really the whole thing. So then you have a seed. I think of it. This is your blueberry, let's say. Then you have blueberry seed inside of your blueberry. And that turns into the fleshy part. Yep. And that's why, like on the, I don't know, I didn't look at everybody's yet, but if people did raspberries, you can see the remaining stigma and style. Those pokey things that you see. No. Tiny little, there you go. These. So here you can now see why this looks like this. So all these sticking out, those are all, can you see this screen? I don't think you can you? Oh, okay. Here we go. Okay, so here's a raspberry, and this is what we just saw. Now, raspberries have many ovaries, and that's why there's so many little parts to it. But if you look here, there is your stigma, your style, and this was the ovary. The ovary developed into the fruit, and inside of that is a seed. So each one of these has a little seed inside of it, and that came from the that whole fertilization we just looked at. But you can see those remnants of all those stigmas and styles. That's where those come from. And if you also can see here, right, the petals haven't fallen off yet. And so you have, these are the stamen, but there is your stigma, your style, the ovary, which has developed into this legume type fruit. And then the peas in there in the pod, those are actually the seeds that contain the embryo, have the seed coat and stuff. And you can see though that in this case, the flowers haven't even fallen completely off yet, the stigma, but that's, this grew into that in stigma style ovary. All right, so that's fertilization. That's complicated as you need to know. That was specifically angiosperms. Like I said, gymnosperms are very similar, not with the ovary, not with the fruit, but they do have the little pollen tube. That is like upside down. Okay. Now, here's the same sort of idea. Yeah. So that's the pollination step. You can see the pollen, and then you've got the egg in here. So then the pollen sits on there, and then it grows its little tube towards the egg, and then fertilization happens. And you've got the embryo or the zygote here. That's the embryo. You've got the seed coat, and you've got the endosperm as well. Now this one doesn't have a double fertilization. So you've just got endosperm tissue here, and then you've got the zygote, which is 2N. Taking it. So the double fertilization part, which is the weird part here where you get the 2 sperm happening, the double fertilization there is what is something that's specific to angiosperms. And basically the fruit won't ripen unless both the future endosperm and the ovary, the egg, are fertilized. So unless both of those combos with sperm form, it's not going to ripen to a fruit. So it doesn't waste energy doing that. So that's one of those synapomorphies. The angiosperms have flowers, fruit, and double fertilization. And those allow to be efficiently pollinated with the flowers. Fruit is for efficient distribution. And then your double fertilization is so it doesn't waste energy making a fruit when it's not even going to grow an embryo. How do you get multiple seeds? The whole setup that we drew here, that whole thing, there can be more than one of them. So if there's more than one of them, then the process happens to many of them and you make many seeds, each of which has its own embryo inside of it. So when you eat a pea, remember peas are actually dry. So like this legume that I showed you with the pod, it's actually a dry fruit. We just eat it before it's mature. So, but when you were eating those peas, you're eating the seed, which has the embryo inside of it. One of those little more complicated things. Are there any straight up questions? Let me look at the thing. I don't have the chat up. Yellow. Oh, here, okay. Blah, blah, blah. Cycles, all the cycles, like as in the different ones for the different groups. Is that what you mean? So this process here, the fertilization, pollination fertilization, because it's so different, we want to know that particular part. And then as far as other parts, should be sufficient to know that it's sporophyte to spore, spore to gametophyte, gametophyte to gamete, gamete back to sporophyte. And then which ones are meiosis, which ones are mitosis, what's fertilization for the plants. And then to understand that the seed, that's a new development that's only in gymnosperms and angiosperms. And the seed is when you get the gametophyte in, where it's the nesting that we just saw. So both seed plants have that, which are both gymnosperms, like a conifer or a cycad. One has that nesting, and so do the angiosperms with the flowers. And the reason it's one of those things that distinguishes, and why it's important is that the seed itself allows the embryo to have its own food, so it doesn't have to get food from the parent plant. And it also is important because when that process happens, and the pollen also prevents it from drying out, so then it doesn't need water for fertilization. But I'm not going to ask you about antheridia and the very specific parts of the cycles. Don't forget the fungus life cycle. People tend to have a problem with that because remember it was all very different with karyogamy and plasmogamy and that stuff. So do go back and look at that for sure because that's very different than what you might have seen before. Okay. Okay, I'm going to answer that. And there is a diagram in the book. Everything is in the book. The reason I made the packet though is because I don't need you to know everything that's in the book. It's too much detail for what I'm interested in for us. So that's the reason I'm not just like, just go read the book and you'll know everything, because it's going to be way too much to do 28 through 31 entirely. If you've looked the packet, like, you don't need to know all that at all. And so this is just what we've drawn. So this is that process there of making, it's like the sporophyte to the spore, spores to the gametophyte to the gametes. And then here's the same thing, sporophyte to the spores, spores to the gametophytes to gametes. And then here's what we did with this. And then the double fertilization. You can see all those processes closer. There's the double fertilization, and then the endosperm and the zygote and the seed coat. And then the zygote, yeah, there's the seed coat. And then the zygote would be inside the seed coat. That would mature into seeds, and then your outside fruit, and then that grows into your new sporophyte. Yeah. I will have you do foods for each one. So you need foods for each group. You also need economic ideas for each group. And yeah, flowers pretty straightforward. So I have all this. This is all. And then looking at what might get pollinated by what. So these are just knowing the characteristics of the different flowers, particularly. Oh, and then here's some ideas of economic roles. So you can take a look at that in the slide notes. Besides just like, you can't just say, oh, people plant flowers in their gardens. You could use bouquets and that kind of thing, because that is, I mean, that's a big money generator, but that's just one thing. So you probably just want to think of something else for flowers. And then fruit can't just be like people harvest fruit. There's other things you can think of. I mean, this is sort of what I thought of as like random stuff. Yeah, and then leaves and roots and stems are all in those the spoken lectures as well as in the notes. Those are part of the Synapomorphies that are the important, like some of the important Synapomorphies that allowed the evolution of plants into different environments. So sporal pollen at the beginning is one of those. Dependent embryo. You've got the vascular tissue, which allows transport of, the water and food and minerals throughout the body versus just having to do diffusion and osmosis. We've got seeds and pollen, which both prevent drying out. Sperm. That allows the gymnosperms to start living on drier environments, and then the flowers, fruit, and the double fertilization. And the angiosperms are the most successful, or they're the most common plants now. So the angiosperms, there's a lot more diversity of those than everything else because pollination is really efficient. So this is what I was talking about with the plant diversity notes. It's ecological roles, economic roles, the phyla, characteristics, and why they're important. So I tried to make it clear why each of these was important, what it's allowed that group to do. So this is outline form of that. Is there any part of this that you guys were having trouble filling out? essentially of like what would the fruit look like for these kind of, or excuse me, what, yeah, the flower look like for different pollination. The ones that come to mind for me, red and tubular, hummingbirds. Hummingbirds hover when they eat, so they don't have to land on anything. So the tubular ones, sort of parts. Yeah, with the pollinators, do we need to know pollinators? You need to be able to match them with the flowers. So I'm going to give you pictures of different flowers and ask you what pollinators would go with that. And so the best way to, in the notes, and then that's reflected in the module on the part about plant reproduction. So, and this is also in the note slides as well, but this is the types of pollinators. You can download it. Major characteristics. You can also look at this key here and download that. So basically, wind is something that's going to blow, right? Wind's going to be something fuzzy, something with little propellers along the lines of that. So you need something that can catch the air. Moths, white, and because they're out at nighttime, white and fragrant, white and fragrant. Whereas bats, also white, they're out at night too, but probably very big, and a lot of pollen, because bats are pretty big. Flies and beetles, it smells bad. I wouldn't ask difference between those per se. Yeah, let's see. Butterflies, a variety of things, but tubular butterflies, red in particular is hummingbirds. So tubular red, you think of hummingbird. Other tubular ones, butterflies. Bees tend to land on plants that have like a wide petal. So there's some place they can land. They can also eat other ones, but usually that's what I would do. So if they have a place to land, bee, tubular, red, hummingbird, tubular, otherwise butterfly. Flies, it smells bad. Bats, it's a big white one. Moths, it's a little white one that work for them. There's my thing. The difference. Okay, I got a question. I got lots of questions. Monocots and Eudicots. And there's also one I think I saw. What's the 2 organ systems, 5 major organ? Yeah. Shoot organ system, root organ system, and then you've got, roots, stems, leaves, flowers, fruit. Okay. So monocots and eudicots, so they have the different structural features, mostly is what we're looking at. There are 2 of the 5 types of flowering plants. So really, if we look at angiosperms, the flowering plants, there's these groups here. And monocots and eudicots are 2 of those. And eudicots are the most common and most diverse angiosperms, but I would just have you look at the different characteristics of different pictures, and you'd want to be able to classify whether it's a monocot or eudicot. So did I close it? No, here. Okay. So okay, so you got roots and the difference, and I do go through these in the different lectures that are posted, and should also be in the notes as well. Just make sure I'm sharing. Good. All right, so the two ways that you tell the roots apart is one is their external features. So you got the taproot for the Eudicots with lateral roots, the one big root. And then you have the fibrous roots, which just extend from the stem, and that's the monocots. So if you think monocots are grass, if you can remember monocots are grasses, that might help you in general, because or lilies. Because a lot of times people kind of know what grass characteristics are. Like if you pull grass out, it has just all the little fibrous roots. And then the thing that you notice here, the roots have the vasculature in the middle, vascular cylinder, and the monocots have a ring of vasculature, meaning the xylem and phloem, so particularly the xylem. And then the Eudicots have the X of xylem. So that's the two differences, the X of xylem versus pictures of that. And then you have the adaptations, modifications of each of them. Go through those in the notes. All right, so then you've got stems. So how do you tell the stems? You can only tell the stems from cutting it. So this is the cut through. You have scattered bundles for monocots, and you have a ring of the vascular bundles, the xylem and phloem, for the Eudicots. And it makes sense that the ring would be the Eudicots because they're the only ones that get fatter and do that secondary growth. So like between the green and the red, that's where that vascular cambium is, that layer of dividing tissues. And so monocots don't get fatter. They, like grass, it doesn't get woody. Not all Eudicots do, but a lot of Eudicots, like let's say a flowering tree, obviously it's gotten fatter and fatter and fatter over time. And that's that secondary growth, which depends on this inside-outside division. Yeah. So woody is Eudicots. Eudicots make the rings if they're woody Eudicots, so they have the ring in the stem. There's those rings I talked about. Angiosperm leaves, parallel leaves, or parallel veins, like grass. If you think of grass, you know it has the veins, or you think of a lily. That's a monocot, and then the branching of various types, Eudicots. You guys probably, when you did your leaves in your lab manual, probably saw mostly Eudicot leaves, because they're some more common monocots. Then I could also give you a cut through. So parallel leaves, this is the parallel veins, I should say, parallel veins. You can see that, so that's still a monocot. And then this is the Eudicot, one main vein. I should show this one. And then there's branching veins, but this is a cut through, so you just see the main vein there. Also has 2 layers versus 1 Eudicot, 2 layers of mesophyll versus 1 layer. And then you've got the flower. So that was roots, stems, leaves. Flowers is the groups of 3, or 3 or 6 or 9, something like that. That's monocots. And then Eudicots is 4s and 5s. So that's just petals. And then there's the cotyledons, which are like sort of like embryonic leaves sorts. And you can see that here. That's where the name comes from. Monocot, monocotyledon, like one cotyledon versus dicot or Eudicot, which has 2 of those. So that's in the embryo, like little embryonic leaves. Yeah, the short answers are basically reflected in the packet. So it'll say possible essay for all of those. This is that, the outline to fill in plant part outline. So under each of those, and here's the pictures of Eudicots, monocots. It'll be like, oh, look. possible essay. So pretty much adaptations, modifications, economic uses. I'd also say foods for each of them. So you need an example of a food for each of the parts. Some that people tend to confuse. Celery is part of the leaf, humongous petiole of the leaf. White potatoes are stems, just tuber stems underground. Sweet potatoes are roots. What else do people mix up? The florets of broccoli are flowers. Structure. Someone leave or someone asked a question? And the modifications. So basically, let's see. And these are notes too. So on each of these modifications, I give a bunch of examples of those. So you need to know some of those. And then at the end of each of them, we'll get through economic roles, economic impacts. The only hormones are the ones that I have on here in the notes. You know, major details about those. I'm not asking major details about, I don't ask anything about light. So if you're trying to read the chapters without looking at the packet for focusing and you're trying to learn all that, and you're like, oh my gosh, what's this blue light? I mean, the only thing I say about light ever is that the stems bend towards blue light, but not other lights. But like, you don't need to know the period and all that stuff. You happen to be looking at that. Yeah, because there's a lot of 28 to 31 that you're not responsible for. And then also, how fruits are if you had a picture of a fruit or photograph of a fruit, what's the most likely way it's dispersed? Because fruit, remember, is dispersal. Actually, the seed, sometimes people get confused. The seed is, its food is inside the seed in that endosperm tissue here. The fruit is not food for the plant. The fruit is a dispersal mechanism of some sort. So it's either, you know, going in the air. So if you see a fruit that is, again, sort of like the, all right, let me backtrack on this. So wind can be for pollination or for fruit dispersal. So you're looking at light, fuzzy kind of things, especially for fruit. With the pollination, massive amounts of pollen being made, kind of wavy, bendy features for the pollination for that. For the wind here, you're looking at, like, see these guys. So these would all be wind dispersed. Weeds. Coconuts and other things near water dispersed. This would be like burrs sticking to fur and other animals to disperse the seeds. We've got animals that eat seeds or eat the fruit but don't digest it, digest the seed part, and so that could just basically move the fruits around and sometimes forget where they put them. So animals, wind, and water, and then underneath animals, there's a few different ways. And I was always having trouble myself remembering, I mean, simple fruits, obvious, but compound fruits, I was having trouble remembering the difference or understanding between aggregate and multiple fruit or compound fruit. Think of that. So, or aggregate fruit means a bunch of little fruits all together. So little fruit, it's all a bunch of little fruits all together. And these are actually little drupes. They have one little seed inside of them. We looked at this before. But you've got like a bunch of ovaries in one flower, and then all of those ovaries turn into their own fruits, and so then you get this like aggregation of little fruits. Versus once I saw the pineapple and how I have a link for the pineapple if anyone did pineapples. I saw how pineapples develop, and basically it's like all these separate flowers, and then each flower makes a segment of the pineapple, and they all fuse together. So it's one big fruit. This whole thing is a fruit, and but it's from a bunch of flowers. So it made sense to be multiple fruit because it's like multiple flowers, many flowers, and they all fuse together into one fruit. Versus aggregation of individual fruits all together that are all just an aggregated bunch of little fruits versus a multiple fruit, multiple flowers. I'm not going to ask you anything about receptacle or where is the where are the different parts coming from besides the fruit comes from the ovary, the seeds come from the ovules. Here's that same thing in a gymnosperm that we were talking about before. Sporophyte makes the spore. The spore then divides into a gametophyte. The gametophyte makes the gametes. The other gamete comes, all in tube this time too. Fertilization happens in there. You've got the endosperm food, embryo, seed coat. No fruit though.